He's 77 years old, and you're putting him in handcuffs? That's the voice you hear on the body cam, another officer, not a bystander. Moments earlier, the arresting deputy had said, "Sir, step out of the vehicle or you will be detained." The man's response? "I'm on my own land." Within seconds, the situation spirals. Doors open, commands are repeated, and the 77-year-old cowboy is pulled from his truck and arrested. But here's the part that raised serious questions later. The charges didn't stick. The footage went public, and what started as a routine call turned into a legal battle over property rights, probable cause, and whether officers crossed the line they didn't fully understand. So the question becomes, how does a situation like this escalate so quickly, and who was actually in the right? Before we go anywhere further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The man at the center of this case is Harold Jenkins, a lifelong rancher living in a rural county where most people know each other by name. He's not a criminal. No violent record, no history of confrontations with law enforcement. By all accounts, Jenkins lived a quiet life, working his land, maintaining fences, and driving the same old pickup truck he'd owned for years. On the day of the incident, Jenkins was doing something completely ordinary, checking a boundary fence on the edge of his property. But what he didn't know was that someone had called law enforcement reporting a suspicious vehicle trespassing on private land. That vehicle was his, and that misunderstanding is where everything begins. Body cam footage shows a patrol truck pulling up slowly behind Jenkins' pickup. Dust kicks up as the officer steps out. "Sir, can I talk to you for a second?" Jenkins, still seated in his truck, looks over calmly. "You can talk." The officer approaches, already sounding slightly cautious. "We got a call about someone trespassing out here. This your property?" Jenkins nods. "Has been for 40 years. Now, this is where things start to shift. The officer asks for identification. Jenkins pauses. "For what?" "Just to verify who you are." Jenkins responds, still calm but clearly firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's tone tightens. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." And here's where the tension builds. Jenkins doesn't comply immediately. "I'm not stepping out unless you tell me why I'm being detained." There's a pause. Another officer arrives. Now 2 deputies are standing outside the truck. "Step out of the vehicle now." Jenkins shakes his head. "I'm on my land. I'm not going anywhere." And then everything changes. The door is opened. Hands reach in. "Step out or you will be removed." Within seconds, Jenkins is pulled from the vehicle, turned around, and placed in handcuffs. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting." But at this point, the decision has already been made. He's under arrest. Now, this is where we need to slow things down and look at the law. Because at first glance, both sides may feel justified. Officers responded to a call about a suspicious person possibly trespassing, and many jurisdictions, that gives them the authority to investigate. This is what's known as reasonable suspicion, a legal standard that allows officers to briefly detain someone to figure out what's going on. But here's the key question. Did that suspicion still apply once Jenkins said he owned the land? Generally, courts look at whether the officer had specific, articulable facts suggesting a crime was happening. If Jenkins was on his own property and nothing contradicted that, then the justification for detaining him becomes weaker. Now let's talk about identification. In some states, there are stop and identify laws that require a person to give their name during a lawful detention. But that only applies if the detention itself is valid. And this is where things get complicated. If the officer no longer had a valid reason to detain Jenkins, then demanding ID and escalating when he refused could raise serious legal concerns. Now let's go back to the footage. Jenkins is now in handcuffs, standing beside his truck. "What am I being arrested for?" he asks. The officer responds, "Failure to comply and obstruction." Now, this is a critical moment because obstruction charges are often used in situations where someone refuses to follow commands, but those commands must be lawful to begin with. Jenkins is placed in the back of the patrol vehicle. Meanwhile, officers begin searching his truck. No warrant, no clear explanation, just a quick statement. We're going to check the vehicle. Inside, they find nothing illegal. No weapons, no contraband, nothing suggesting criminal activity at all. And yet, Jenkins is still taken to jail, booked, processed, and held for several hours before being released. For a 77-year-old man with no criminal history, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was a serious ordeal. And it didn't end there. Now we need to look at the deeper legal issues. First, vehicle search. Under the Fourth Amendment, searches generally require a warrant. However, there are exceptions. One is a search incident to arrest. Another is probable cause, if officers believe there's evidence of a crime inside the vehicle. But here's a problem. What was the crime? If the arrest itself is questionable, then any search tied to that arrest may also be challenged. This is often referred to as the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, meaning evidence obtained from an unlawful action can be thrown out. Now let's talk about obstruction. In many states, obstruction requires actively interfering with an officer's lawful duties. Simply refusing to answer questions or declining to exit a vehicle without a clear legal basis may not meet that standard. And this is where officer discretion becomes critical. Officers have the authority to make decisions in the moment, but authority does not mean unlimited power. Departments often have policies emphasizing de-escalation, especially when dealing with elderly individuals or situations that aren't clearly criminal. So the real issue here isn't just legality, it's judgment. Was this situation handled in a way that made sense, or did it escalate unnecessarily? After Jenkins was released, the charges were reviewed, and within days, they were dropped. No obstruction, no trespassing, nothing. But the story didn't end there. Jenkins filed a complaint, then a lawsuit, alleging unlawful arrest, excessive force, and violation of his constitutional rights. The body cam footage was eventually released to the public, and that's when things really took off. Viewers noticed the same thing many are noticing now. There was no clear moment where Jenkins appeared to be committing a crime. The department responded stating that the officers were acting on a reported call and following procedure. But internal reviews were launched, and the incident quickly became a case study in how quickly a routine encounter can go wrong. So let's break this down clearly. Did the officers have a reason to approach Jenkins? Yes, a call on suspicious activity can justify an initial investigation. But once Jenkins stated he owned the property and there was no evidence contradicting that, the situation should have shifted. Did the officer have legal authority to demand ID? Maybe, but only if the detention itself was still valid. And that's where things start to fall apart. Because if the detention wasn't justified, then escalating to arrest becomes highly questionable. Now, let's be fair. Officers often deal with uncertain situations. They have to make quick decisions with limited information. But here's the key point. Having authority does not automatically mean the decision was wise, necessary, or proportional. Jenkins, on the other hand, remained relatively calm. He questioned the officer, but he didn't threaten, flee, or escalate physically. Could he have stepped out of the vehicle to avoid the situation? Possibly. But the law doesn't always require compliance with commands that lack legal basis. And that's the balance here. This wasn't a dangerous suspect. This wasn't a volatile scene. This was a property owner on his own land. And yet it ended in handcuffs. That's why accountability matters. Because if situations like this go unchecked, they set a precedent that can affect anyone. There are a few key takeaways from this situation. First, remain calm. Even when you believe you're right, escalating emotionally can make things worse. Second, understand that not every command must be followed blindly, but challenging officers on the spot can carry risks. Third, document everything when possible. Body cam footage played a major role in this case. And finally, if something feels wrong, handle it later in court, not on the roadside. Ask if you're being detained. Ask if you're free to leave. And if things escalate, request a lawyer and stop answering questions. Because the street is not the place to win a legal argument. That happens afterward. So, what do you think? Was this lawful police work based on a misunderstanding, or did this officer take a routine situation way too far?